901 from high atop Clifton, Ohio. Thanks everybody for joining us this morning. Welcome to our January Roundtable. I'm Carl Gerdemuller. I'm Executive Director of the Real Estate Center here at the University of Cincinnati. Thanks for joining us to hear more about the office market in a post-pandemic world. I think that this will be a very timely and informative discussion given the current state of affairs that we're all dealing with. Before we get started, a few announcements. When you join the meeting, when we let you into the meeting, you're automatically put on mute. So please keep yourself on mute during the call to avoid any background noise. Secondly, there will be slides being shown from all of our presenters. So it's maybe best to put your computer on a side-by-side speaker view. That way you'll be able to see the slides as well as the speakers off to the side. Number three, we will be recording this session today and we'll make it available for those who may want it. Number four, we will have a question and answer period at the end of the presentation. You can use the chat function to ask any questions, enter in the question, and I'll be able to see them here and convey them to the speakers. Finally, and most importantly, I do want to acknowledge our partners and members whose support makes these roundtable events possible. The scholarships that we give out every year, our many additional outreach programs, couldn't do it without these folks. Our premier partner, PNC Bank, our platinum partner, Eagle Realty Group, our gold partners, BBT, Truist Bank, Brandy Corp, First Financial Bank, Hills Properties, Nair Properties, North American Properties, and finally Procter & Gamble. And then finally, our 50 members of the Bear Board, whose names you will see here shortly on a couple of slides. Without the generosity of these folks, without their time, commitment, and without their talents, we would not be able to do what we do. So thanks to all of you. We will be exploring a number of topics today from both a provider and an occupier standpoint. Among other things, we'll look at the immediate and longer term impacts of the pandemic on the office market. There's been a whole new acronym created by this pandemic, WFH, or work from home. We'll look at how work from home is impacted and will continue to impact office trends and occupancy rates moving forward. Finally, we'll look at what the data suggests as to what might be a return to normalcy. I will put the word normalcy in quotes because I think that can take many forms. With that said, let me introduce our speakers. Calvin Schneider is the Senior Vice President of Research and Economic Analysis at NAREIT, based out of Washington, D.C. Calvin's focus is the analysis of data and developments in the macro economy and the impact on REITs and commercial property markets more from a provider perspective. Kevin Hughes is Regional Managing Principal for Cushman & Wakefield right here in Cincinnati. He oversees operations in Ohio, Kentucky, and Michigan with 200 employees here in the Cincinnati office. And finally, David Smith is Head of Occupier Research for the Americas for Cushman & Wakefield based out of Atlanta, Georgia. He has been actively looking at the impact of the pandemic on trends within the occupier space. So we'll see things from a couple of different perspectives this morning. With that said, and to kick things off, I will turn the program over to Calvin Schneider. Calvin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Carl, and for inviting me, and thank you, University of Cincinnati and PNC for sponsoring this conference. This is a number of times that I've spoken at conferences there and enjoy the collaboration. It's always been a good discussion. So I'm an economist at NAREIT, and we represent the REITs. And REITs are some of the larger owners of commercial real estate in the US. So I'm going to be looking at some of the longer term trends in the office market and try to give some perspective before we turn it over to Kevin and David, who are working much more on the ground with what's going on. So let me pull up my slides here. Wait, I need to. share screen. And sorry, 1 second, I need to.
Just hit the F5 key, Calvin.
Yeah, okay, here. There, all right. Here we go. I've done that. The challenge with analyzing what's going on in the office market is that there's both a cyclical and a longer term impact of the pandemic. And the longer term effects are what we're really interested in here. There can be changes of how people interact in public, how we use office space. We already started talking about work from home. This is mostly about work from home. And I'm going to present a bit of perspective of a longer time period because we can learn from some of the previous periods of cyclical change. And one of the really important things to understand is that new supply adjusts fairly quickly to bring the markets back into balance. There have been a lot of changes in office real estate, other parts of real estate, overall economy. People talk about, economists always saying, well, are things in equilibrium? Well, the economy is never in equilibrium. There are bumps that push it off of equilibrium, and it tends to move back towards an equilibrium path. And we are clearly seeing a very large bump. We will move back towards equilibrium. So one of the messages for the longer term investors in commercial real estate is that this market is going to be back on an even keel. It's probably going to take, it could be 3, maybe 5 years. I'm not sure. But there will definitely be impacts on overall demand. But I think what might be some of the most interesting things to see based on the preliminary analysis that I've been doing is some of the geographic patterns. And I'll get to that in just a minute. So the key points that I've seen in following the market is work from home is here to stay. One of the biggest surprises of the pandemic is how well productivity has been maintained in most offices for many functions. Not everyone can work from home. Those of us who are able to are fortunate, but a lot of the economy can function reasonably well with work from home. The other message, though, is office is here to stay. You do surveys of people. You do surveys of employers. I've seen a lot of surveys, and everyone is saying we would like to get back to the office. Now, you put those two together and say, well, if they're both here to stay, what's going to be the solution? There's going to be a lot more flexibility. You're going to have people who are working from home for functions that they could do easily, but they're showing up at the office for some of the other tasks where the teamwork is more important. You're going to see a prioritization of job functions. So there's some things that are very easy to do from home, but if you're starting, if you have an existing project with an existing team where you're in the middle of it and everyone knows what they're doing, we can all do that from home with email, Zoom, phone calls, and everything. The challenges are if you have a new project and you want to have a brainstorming session, if you have a new team, you want to get people integrated, younger people who are trying to find a mentor, trying to get exposure, you need to have in the office for those things. Or something like signing a major contract, a major deal, negotiation, hiring people. These are things that are going to remain in the office. I mentioned that productivity has been reasonably well maintained. Well, that's in the short run. That's because most of the projects that we were doing 3 months in, 6 months in, 9 months into the pandemic were already ongoing, or the teams were in place. How much can we maintain productivity next year? We don't really know. I'm hoping that the vaccine means we don't need to do it next year. Another important point is I mentioned that we're always moving towards a new equilibrium. One of the changes over the past decade was there was an increase in office density, a move from individual enclosed offices towards more shared workspaces, common work areas, and less square feet per worker. Well, clearly, over the near term, that's going to be reversed. The question is longer term, how is that going to look? So with that, I'm going to get into just about a half a dozen slides to give you some of a longer term perspective for the drivers of the medium term outlook. So this slide is showing office using employment. First Friday of every month, we see the payroll report. People pay a lot of attention to it. That's total non-farm payrolls, but that includes things like manufacturing, retail, hotels, a lot of people who are not in an office. This is looking at the trend in office employment going back over the past 20 years. And you can see, three things that would jump out to me here were that, first of all, there have been fluctuations. We see that during the 2001-2002 recession, there was a decline in office employment. During the Great Financial Crisis, 12 or 13 years ago, there was a much bigger decline. And in the current period, we obviously have a big, sharp decline. Second one, though, is this long-term trend growth. I'm going to keep coming back to this idea. If you look from 2010 through 2020, there's a decade of very steady growth where you went from 27 some million to 34 million. That was a really big increase in office employment. So what I said at the outset, that adjustments in new supply move the market towards equilibrium. When you have this type of longer term trend growth in office employment, it's much easier to absorb the short-term shocks. Now, the third point is, holy cow, look at what's going on in office using employment over the past 10 months. The time frame is really compressed in terms of the sharp drop and the snapback. Now, what we really want to study in terms of the longer term effects are not what we see in this drop and snapback. That's really the cyclical move. So next couple of slides, I'm going to try to give some context for how to sort out what are the longer term effects from the shorter term effects. Okay, I'm an economist. Supply and demand, we got to talk about supply and demand. And they both intersect in the office vacancy rate. So here we are looking at over the same time period. You can see there's cyclical patterns in office vacancies that they can rise by several percentage points during a recession, and then they fall during the expansion. This is normal. We understand this. We see in the current period, there's already been a fairly sharp pickup in the vacancy rate. These data go through just the third quarter. I do have some fourth quarter data, but not on a national basis. But this is showing through just 2 or 3 quarters of the recession what has gone on with office vacancies. One of the big questions you should be asking as well, is this a cyclical upturn or is this a longer term structural issue? I'll get to that in just a minute or two. The vacancy rate is the intersection of the supply and the demand. So let's take a look at what's going on with the supply. This is the growth of office stock. I say construction. So this is the annualized growth rate of new office stock. But here I'm going back over 45 years. You can see that this has a lot of scope for change. People who've been in the market for a while know that in the 1980s, there was a huge office boom, huge boom in office construction. You can see the national office stock was growing at 5 to 6% per year. That is a massive growth rate. Unfortunately, that contributed to the very bad crisis that followed in 1989, 1991. But that very rapid supply growth gives you an idea of what a speculative boom really looks like. So the late 90s, we saw another boom. But at this point, it only grew to 2.5% office stocks. So it was a bit more moderated boom. And then you saw that the growth slowed again. 2007, 2008, that qualified as a boom, but it was 1.5%. So the growth rate in the 80s was 4 times what we saw in 2008. Coming into this crisis, I was actually pretty sanguine about the outlook for office because the office stock was growing barely 1%. And I say, you have these past crises when it was going 2%, 3%, 8%, 6%, not 8. You have a lot less supply overhang in a market like we had up till the beginning of last year. I put together some of the pieces of data that I had in the first couple of slides. The first one that I showed was the total office employment And then I had the vacancy rate, which was the occupied space divided by the total space. Well, if I take the occupied space and I look at the employment, we can look at the square foot per worker. Now, this is similar to what a lot of people who work in the real estate business will look at, but many times their data are based on surveys of buildings. As an economist, I tend to trust the broadest measure possible. And these show similar trends to what a lot of people see when they look at individual offices, individual buildings, national, local markets, and so on. But this gives us an idea where we can compare over 20 years or so the trends in office space per worker. Now, similar to some of the other discussion, we have two things going on here. We have cyclical effects and we have longer term structural effects. So you can see in the 2001 recession and 2008 recession, you had a spike in square feet per worker. That's because the number of leases, people don't adjust their leases really quickly, although they may adjust their workforce. This gives rise to a shadow vacancy. I was looking at the vacancy rates earlier, and that's the vacant space that is not leased. This is something different. When you had the square feet per worker rising above 245 feet per worker, 205 square feet per worker, that's because you had some shadow vacancies where there was an empty office within some leased space. So that's a cyclical effect. As we look at that long decline from 2010 through 2019, which corresponds to, I'm going to flip back here. That corresponds obviously to the large rise in office employment over this period. That long decline, now part of it was absorbing the shadow vacancies. So if there were a tenant that had 100 employees and they fired 7 of them during the financial crisis, and they had 7 vacant offices, but then they hired 2 more workers per year, they absorbed that space. The rest of that trend, though, was what I was talking about earlier with the longer term structural shift in the way the office is used. Fewer enclosed offices, individual enclosed offices, and more shared common workspace. And it brought us down to a very low level of square feet per worker. Now let's focus on what's going on in the current period. This spike, again, it's going to have a mix of short-term cyclical effects and longer-term structural effects. What we're seeing here really is almost entirely the short-term cyclical effects. So unfortunately, we can't draw a lot of conclusions from it. But you can see the space per worker rose quite a bit, and that's because we saw the number of workers drop, but we have not seen that much change in the amount of space that's been leased. So this sets us up for trying to analyze what's the medium and longer term outlook in terms of how is office space used. This next slide gets at the issue that I raised when I first showed the vacancy rate. And I said, oh, is this a typical cyclical upturn in vacancy? What I'm doing here is breaking out the change in vacancy rate to how much was from new supply and how much was from a decline in demand, a drop in leased space. You can see that in 2001, we're looking at an almost 2-year period from the peak to the trough. The increase in supply added 4 percentage points to the vacancy rate. Now, if you recall, when I was looking at 2001, that was a time when you had the office stock growing at 2.5% to 3%. So if you have new supply coming in at 2.5% to 3% for 2 years, it's easy to see why that new supply adds 4 percentage points to the vacancy rate. Over that 2-year period, the amount of leased space declined enough that it only subtracted 50 basis points. So the decline added 50 basis points to the vacancy rate. So most of the swing here was through the supply channel. You can see I talked at the outset how adjustments in supply will help equilibrate. Well, if you stop new construction and demand hasn't changed that much, the market comes back into equilibrium fairly quickly. You saw a similar thing in 2008. Most of the change was because of the new supply, with only about 30 basis points of the rise in vacancy rates due to drop in demand. Look at the one on the right, though. That's what we have in just 2 quarters of the current pandemic. In 2 quarters, we had the amount of leased space fall by half a percentage point. That is, in 2 quarters, we had more of a change in vacancy rate from drop in demand than we had during the entire recession of 2001 or the entire recession of 2008. New supply had very little to it. This suggests that this pandemic is having a much bigger impact on office demand than I had really expected. It's having a much bigger effect in terms of, and this is work from home. Here we're seeing actual aggregate numbers on what's going on with work from home. My next slide, I just did yesterday morning very quickly, and it's not labeled very carefully because I did it really quickly. But I was able to look at a group of metro areas where I actually have data through the 4th quarter. And it's actually interesting. We can link together what's going on in the office, what's going on with the apartment market. And I think this tells us something about what's going on in terms of how work from home is affecting the demand. So let me explain here. The major metro areas, I looked at 3 major metro areas: San Francisco, New York, and Washington, D.C. And then I looked at nearby areas where there may be people who are moving out or working from related areas, or there could be business that's spilling over. So San Francisco, you've got Sacramento an hour or so away. You've got the Inland Empire. New York, Long Island is very close. Stamford, Connecticut is within normal commuting distance. Washington, D.C., Richmond, Virginia, it's a bit far for commuting business, but there are a lot of companies that do have satellite operations there. And what you can see here, now I haven't labeled these, the vacancy shows the rise in vacancy rates in basis points through the pandemic. And the rent is showing the change in rent in percentage points. So that's why one is in hundreds, the other is in single digits. Office vacancies are up 130 basis points. But you look at Sacramento and Inland Empire, and they're up 20 or 30 basis points. That suggests that the high cost area has had more of a reduction in office space. So if people are able to work from home and telecommute, it's the high cost areas that are being hit the hardest. You see a similar thing, New York City and actually Long Island has had a fairly large rise in vacancy rates. Stamford, Connecticut has had no rise. So again, it's the high cost markets where people are breaking the leases, they're moving out. You're seeing subletting, you're seeing much more of an impact of work from home. Similar thing in Washington, D.C. The rent data confirm this. The rents fell in San Francisco, 7%. They're down 5% in New York City. They're flat in Washington, but the related nearby areas, there may not be commuting, but the related nearby areas have actually had steady to rising rents. Now, what's also interesting is look at this next column on multifamily. You see actually a much stronger divergence that vacancy rates have risen by hundreds of basis points in the major cities, but they've fallen in the outer areas. They've fallen in Sacramento, Long Island, Stamford, not Long Island, sorry, I've read that one wrong, Richmond, Virginia. This is consistent with people actually moving out of the big cities into places that are nearby, that if they have to drive in once a week, they could do that. And you see a very strong trend in the rents as well. So this is actually preliminary data. We don't have, these are not final numbers for the 4th quarter yet. This is actually suggesting that the geographic imprint of the pandemic, of work from home, is showing up very much in the office market and also the apartment market. I'm going to stop the share here and just wrap up with my comments. I think I'm pretty close to the time that I'm supposed to take. So what I've shown here is I want to emphasize some of the main points. First of all, we have a lot of history with shocks affecting the office market, many other parts of the economy, but they do tend to adjust, and typically on the time frame of 2 to 3, maybe 4 or 5 years for a large effect. And I think that is going to happen. The second is it's very difficult to sort out the cyclical from the longer term impacts. And even what I showed here of how the pandemic is shifting office demand from major cities, from high cost areas into high cost markets, into lower markets, and even more so in the multifamily, we still don't know if that's permanent or cyclical. I suspect that it's a bit of both. I think a lot of this might be reversed. I think 2 years from now, 3 years from now, we're still going to see a lot of people wanting to be in San Francisco and in New York because offices are really productive when you are close to your collaborators. That's why offices exist. But this suggests that there will still be some longer term impacts. And I think it's going to be a prioritization of job functions. The central management, the senior sales teams, the senior leadership are still going to be in that office most days a week. Many of the other functions could be work from home near that office, or they could be moved out to satellite locations. We don't really know though. As an economist, I've been doing this for a while, and I'm always surprised by things that I'm pretty confident about, and I turn out to be wrong. So I'm waiting to see what I'm wrong about with this market in the future. So that's my wrap up here. So I'll turn it back to you, Carl.
Thank you, Calvin. I appreciate that. Very insightful. And I guess we should be thankful that the run up in supply over the last couple of years has not been what it was in prior times, because that could have been a lot more drastic on the market. Thanks again. That was terrific. Let me now turn it over to Kevin Hughes with Cushman here in the Cincinnati market. Kevin?
Thanks, Carl. Good stuff, Calvin. So I'm sure many of you tuned in to ULI's Emerging Trends program last month. I was asked to address this very same topic, and I tried to jam like 10 minutes of material into a 3-minute slot, and turned out to be pitiful. So I appreciate the shot of redemption here this morning. This time, of course, I have two really smart guys with me, world-class researchers and presenters. They have a lot of data. They know how to interpret the data. And most importantly, they know how to see through the short-term impacts of the sudden severe recession that we just experienced last spring, and can explain, as Calvin just did, the structural underpinnings of our economy and how those fundamentals will support real estate markets longer term. And we just had an example of that. Your first slide, Calvin, it was a great slide. It showed the steady rise in office using employment from 2009 until about a year ago. So if any of you are worried about the future of office markets, consider this. In this decade, the 20s, in the United States, we will create 5.1 million net new office using jobs. In the last decade, from 2010 to 20, we created 4.5 million new office using jobs. So we're going to need space for these workers. So things are going to be okay. So today I want to remind you, we're talking about the post-COVID period here, which is really next year. So I'm going to do a quick overview of the market, talk about future of the office, and try to stay at like 30,000 feet without any slides. And then David will add to that, but he'll also do a deeper dive into some of these trends and topics. So I'll start with a prediction. Office occupancy, both nationally and locally, is going to continue its decline, and vacancy will peak around the middle of next year. And then all economic indicators that drive office occupancy start turning in the right direction. But it will take, we believe, until 2025 for the office market to return to 2019 performance. You know, I'm talking about vacancy and lease rates. Of course, there are some major markets like Manhattan or, DC and San Francisco that Calvin just talked about that'll be on probably longer term recovery cycles. I mean, might take them longer to take that long jam commute in the subway or the train and wait 40 minutes to get on the elevator. Those things are really not going to impact Cincinnati so much. But for us here in town, the next 18 months or so are going to suck in the office market. But then things the middle of next year actually start to pick up, and they should start to feel fun again. Right now, we're kind of getting off the mat, right? We're all reconsidering the purpose of the office, how we are going to use the office differently in the future, how often should we go there, how much space do we need. It's important to point out, none of this is new thinking though. The pandemic just really accelerated these trends towards flexible space and flexible hours. We've just had this massive work from home experiment thrusted upon us. And it's resulted in some wacky predictions from some folks about the long-term design of demise of office markets, which we really think is irrational. The post-COVID future will be characterized by each industry and each company, having to determine what's the right balance of remote work and that advances their organizational priorities. It's not going to be a future that sees a move towards an office-free world. That's a crazy concept. So I want to pause a little bit on the future and just take a quick moment to look at the modern history of office space. I got into real estate 37 years ago, which is pretty crazy. And at that time, the main purpose of the office was to facilitate management's requirement for centralized command and control. I mean, back then, most office workers were expected to be at their desk a significant part of the day. How else would the boss know what you're doing? Obviously, we're in different times. David will go deeper into the purpose of the office in the knowledge economy. But let me just say that today, when leaders think about their office space, the focus should be on meeting the social needs of employees that reinforce the culture of the organization. Office use and office design needs to support the personal, social needs of employees, because when we do that, the company gets the benefits of collaboration, mentoring, learning, creative ideation, things like that give companies a competitive edge. And it's really, at the end of the day, all about recruiting and retaining talent. Now, I just mentioned the knowledge economy. What am I talking about here? 40 years ago, 20% of the US GDP was created by the creative class. That's the knowledge-based economy. That's office workers. And today, 40 years later, over 50% of the GDP comes from knowledge workers, not industrial, certainly not agriculture. And that's incredible growth over that period of time. People who, the knowledge workers these are people who need to be together in office space, as Calvin just touched on, sharing ideas and experiences, innovating, solving problems, creating new products, new services. This is how we create wealth in our developed world. And COVID has done nothing to interrupt that structural transformation. Some would argue it's even accelerated. So now, of course, we're still in the midst of this horrible global pandemic. And we've had this grand experiment of widespread work from home forced upon us. So what have we learned about productivity in the office versus work from home? Again, Calvin touched on this, but let's break down the last 9 months of 2020 with millions of people working from home. After about 6 months, the research told us that, surprisingly, I think, productivity levels were maintained. Yeah, people were stir crazy. They definitely weren't having as much fun, but we were getting the work done from home. And more good news, communication and collaboration among teams, I think has never been better. It's certainly been the case in our company. If you look at our office here in Cincinnati, the C&W office, in a sense, we're really a collection of like 10 different teams. And throughout the year, each have had regularly scheduled calls and video conferences, definitely more structured communication than before COVID. And that's a good thing. But collaboration between the different teams is all but gone. And that's not good. Now, what's the research tell us about the last 3 or 4 months of 2020? Well, we're definitely seeing a degradation of culture, of innovation, of creativity. We're all seeing Zoom fatigue. Don't ask me to go to another virtual happy hour. I'm tired of that. I've heard complaints about, connections are only happening when we deliberately schedule them, and people are tired of all this. I mean, we thrive on those 5-minute impromptus at the coffee machine or in the hallway. Look, we know that we can do task work from home. We know that we can do at least part of our jobs remotely. There's no question about that. But to thrive at work, we need spontaneity, incidental, occasional conversations, water cooler chat, that kind of thing. That creates the cultural glue that keeps groups together, spawns great ideas. These interactions build lasting relationships. Can't do it, with Zoom calls. This is where people start to really care for one another and the company, by the way, and turnover goes down. You can't replicate that virtually. You just can't do it. Just before Thanksgiving, I saw a survey that found that over 50% of us are struggling to feel connected to our colleagues and the company culture. And that really bums me out. And as a leader, I focus more than anything on culture. I also, around the holidays, read an article about Facebook. Two things jumped out at me. First, pretty crazy. They added 4,200 net new jobs in the second quarter of last year. I mean, that for me, that was the worst quarter of my professional lifetime. But to the point I'm trying to make here, they had just completed an internal employee survey that showed that, and I quote, 70% are eager to return to the office ASAP. And I think that's the sentiment across all industries and companies. Anyway, what's not surprising is that research is clearly showing that employee engagement is being depleted. And the workers most affected by this work from home stuff are the young people, the millennials and the Gen Zs. They're just not getting the mentoring they need. They're missing out on face time with senior management. They're not learning from experienced executives. Our young associates need to show off, right? I mean, this is how they can show people what they can do so they can advance. And they definitely do not feel company culture. So we know this. It's nearly impossible to transmit culture without face-to-face interactions. What we have to do, or we have to ask, I should say, is, what are the long-term impacts of all this? I think in the post-COVID world, companies that are deciding to send people home just to reduce their footprint and thereby reducing their office rent. I mean, I think there's a real price to pay for that. So answering the question about the future of work in the office versus work from home, and the answer is both. For most companies, it will be a hybrid solution. We know that there'll be a lot more remote work, but it's not going to replace the office. Calvin said that too. Office will be the place we go to convene and brainstorm and learn and socialize. The main purpose will be communal. Questions about how do we create a workplace that's an inspiring destination? What amenities do we need? How should we design it? We know now that 78% of us want flexibility and choice when it comes to where we work and when we work. And employees are beginning to figure this out right now. But, important but, flexibility requires active management. So management's going to need to develop new skills, and change management programs will be required. Managers are going to need to adapt and find new approaches to maximize performance, engagement, and well-being. Companies are going to need to invest in better technologies that will support this hybrid model. There's going to be winners and losers, no doubt. There always is through change. And it'll be hugely important for leadership to manage who's in the office and when. You can't just let people randomly choose their remote work days. And David's going to explain this in some more detail. He's also going to tell you about a project that we did along with CoreNet, where we recently revisited hundreds of C-suite executives and corporate real estate professionals. And 81% of them, this is very recent, said they are adopting a hybrid model of in-house and remote work. What's interesting, though, is just 12 months ago, that same group of people, those respondents, we were asked the same question, and only 29% of them, less than a year ago, said that they're planning on moving to a hybrid model. So that's a dramatic change in less than a year. So the pandemic has definitely accelerated change. Another thing I wanted to share with you, around the holidays, I was having a conversation with one of the largest owners of office space here in Cincinnati. He's a client of ours and a friend, long-term friend. And I was making these same points. And his question was, does that really represent office users here in Cincinnati? And I said, look, I'm really talking again about post-pandemic, sometime in next year and beyond. We're definitely all still in the kind of reopening the office mode, and focus is all on health and safety. And those focuses are here to stay, no doubt about it. But yeah, companies that ignore these changes and how we use the office and its purpose, I think are really going to fall behind. So it will be different, but eventually it will be better. So get vaccinated, hang in there. And it's time for me to pass the baton to David. Thanks.
Thanks, Kevin. That was very insightful. An interesting comment about how companies need to focus on the social needs of the employees. I think you can make the argument that those social needs can easily extend beyond the four walls of the office and into the surrounding environments of downtown areas, restaurants, bars, you name it. I mean, that all kind of plays into it, and certainly, adds to addressing those social needs. David,
Amen.
we will turn things over to you. And let me remind everybody that once David is done, we will have time for questions and answers. Use the chat function, and I will convey the questions on to the speakers. So David, take it away.
Thanks so much, Carl. Hopefully everyone can see my screen and hear me okay. I'm going to go through a few kind of key things that Kevin just mentioned or touched on with a little bit more detail on a few of them. One of the things that he mentioned was thinking about the history of the office. So in doing some research over the fall to really think through what does the future of the office look like, we partnered with several academics over at George Washington University for a couple of reasons. One, because we felt like their skill set would help us really understand some of the academic and industry research that's been done historically on the office and on remote work. And two, it also adds a little bit of an outside influence. So we're really looking at it honestly and asking these questions honestly and getting to, I think, answers that make sense and aren't necessarily salesy in nature. And we really wanted to get to what's the future of the office, why does the office exist historically, and how does that shift coming out of the pandemic? So as Kevin mentioned, one of the main drivers of office use historically, if you go back 100, 200 years especially, was management, command and control, bringing people together, being able to know exactly what they're doing and manage what they're doing and manage all that paper as well. The second big one that has reduced over time is the capital needs that couldn't be required or provided, anywhere else. So you could think of this 100 years ago as a typewriter that people would come in to use or the filing system because everything was paper. You could go back to the 1960s or 70s and think about really large server rooms. Even more recently, we've seen a huge shift in the legal sector as they've moved away from law libraries in their offices and been able to reduce their space as all of that is now digital. So those first two drivers of the space have become less and less important as technology has advanced and as we've moved into more of a knowledge and creative economy. There is less management and command and control and more freedom. But the things that the office really does provide that will continue to be important post-COVID are productivity, innovation, knowledge spillovers, agglomeration that happens from people connecting in the office together, both with their colleagues, but also with other people, with other companies that might be in the same building or in the same neighborhood, as Carl just mentioned. And then, of course, the social and cultural needs and wants of employees. And that's interpersonal, building trust with your team, with other colleagues, but it's also about the organization's culture and developing a connection to that culture and some loyalty that comes with that. So there's a lot of data out there about how much people want to work remotely. There's also a deep dive done out of University of Chicago looking at how many people actually can work remotely and how does that differ. Excuse me. And one of the key things coming out of this that organizations on the occupier side are going to need to pay attention to is how they customize their policies and think through them for their industry, for their people, for the geographies that they're in. Because there is pretty large differences across economies and countries, as you can see here. In some cases, 40+% of jobs can be done remotely. In other cases, we're talking about less than 1 in 5. The United States near the top there at about 42, 43%. Several European countries have a higher proportion of their jobs that are likely to be able to be done remotely. And actually, if we get down to it, it's not really the job as much as it is individual tasks. And so McKinsey did a really good deep dive of about 800 occupations and 2,000 activities that those people do to really measure how much can people work remotely and still be effective without real productivity loss. And so the majority of office workers really can only work a day or so outside the office and continue to keep their productivity. You see some proportion that might be able to do it 3 to 5 days and some in the red there and some that might only be able to do it 1 to 2. And so really understanding the tasks that people are doing is going to help develop personas and an understanding of how and where people should be working. It also helps develop a thought around what the purpose of the office is, because it needs to support the tasks and the outcomes that can't happen when you're working remotely or you're working at home. So as I noted earlier, when we partnered with George Washington University, we did a deep dive on industry and academic work and research around how remote work in particular versus in-office work impacts some key outcomes that businesses care about. So productivity and output is one of those. Innovation and creativity is another one. The corporate culture piece, which I mentioned before, is a third one. And then the employee satisfaction and retention experience. And here's what the data really shows is one, as has been noted on this call and probably countless other calls you've been on, a lot of focus work productivity can happen anywhere. You do not need to be in the office to respond to emails. You don't even need a computer anymore to respond to emails. You can do that in the device in your pocket. So a lot of productivity and focus work can get done as well, working remotely or working from home. And in some cases, people feel like they can focus more because they're not being interrupted by those conversations that we both like, but also can impact our flow, if you will. On the innovation and creativity side, the data found what I'll call a mix, but really the point was that getting outside of your office, getting outside of your usual environment is really good for creativity and innovation because it helps you spark new ideas. That's why people do corporate retreats. That's why people go off and kind of work in a space that's not their usual space. It's also why workspaces have been redesigned over the last 5-10 years to be more creative, where you might have a desk, but you also might have a much more comfortable place to sit with a view or with access to green space to really think and work on some of your projects. But all of those are connected to also being able to see people face to face. That creativity is maximized when you can get away, but also can be with your team and be working through projects. And I think that's an important mix of those two things. The culture piece, as was mentioned by Kevin, we've seen a real degradation in people's connection to their organizations through the research that our consulting team does. And this is across geographies, across roles, actually more prevalent among young workers than older workers because they don't have the same networks. But it's a real challenge moving forward is as you move to more flexibility, which there will be, and more agility in your workforce, how do you support that and connect them to the culture, make them feel like they're part of something bigger, get them to believe and buy in and really get excited about the values and the mission of the organization. And that really feeds into employee satisfaction, where again, in some ways, it's nice to be able to work remotely. All of us have probably enjoyed not having to commute. Some days it adds a little bit of time to our day or allows us some flexibility to handle some personal items throughout the day and have a better balance or integration between our work and our life. But there's also days over time that employee satisfaction can drop when people are working remotely. And some of that comes back to the culture piece that you can see on the left, where about half of people here in the US indicate that they're struggling to connect to the culture. It's even worse in Europe. If you look at just having a sense of well-being, it's the least bad, if you will, in the US, but 41% of US workers indicate that they don't have a sense of well-being during this pandemic-induced work from home experiment. Again, it gets higher in both Asia Pacific and then in Europe as well. And then another piece is this fact that people are not feeling like they're learning at the same level that they were before. So a third globally, on average, 34% in the US, a little bit lower in APAC and a little bit higher in Europe, are indicating that they're not learning right now. So what does this mean for the future of the office? Well, one thing is that we've all touched on is that it's not binary. This is not a discussion around should we be 100% in the office all the time or should we be 100% remote. Now, I will say there are going to be some organizations who do both of those things. Some organizations who decide, no, we're a company that's office centric and it's part of our culture. And so people need to be in all the time. And there are going to be some organizations who say, yeah, let's try this out. Let's cut these costs. Let's be creative. Let's access employment bases that that have no geographic bounds. And there are some real benefits to that, of course. But here's some data actually from Gallup that shows that pre-COVID, engagement levels were lowest among people on either of those extremes. If they were in the office all the time, meaning they worked remotely none of the time, they're on the left, or if they were working remotely all the time, their engagement levels are equal and lower than everyone else's engagement levels. So we should expect that that's the place that people are going to want to get to. Kevin talked about this, the data we collected from CoreNet. And there's a couple of things that are interesting to me. One is the point he made, which is the hybrid went from less than a third of organizations who are thinking about their workforce or their workplace approach as hybrid to 80% as they look towards a post-COVID world. But the other piece is that remote first didn't change at all. Essentially, 1 in 10 respondents said pre-COVID, yeah, our workplace strategy was about remote first, and about 1 in 10 say that afterwards. And I think that's a recognition that that's not the new norm. That's not the expectation. It's going to be much more of an ecosystem that includes a core office, number 5 there. Or number 6, where people come in on a pretty regular basis. It's also going to include people working from home sometimes. And then it's going to include people dropping in other places, whether they need on-demand event space, whether they would just stop at their coffee or they stop at a library nearby and cut down on the commute, but get out of their house and have the technology to connect with their team and do the work. The one other point I would make is just, as Kevin noted, this does have to be managed. So if you just start telling employees they can work remotely, but no one's really tracking or thinking through when and how they do that, there's 2 options. One is everyone just takes Monday and Friday off, and you need the exact same real estate because everyone's there Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and you're just completely underutilized at the beginning and end of the week. The other option is people sort of randomly come or into the office whenever they want to, and you can see on the left there just really sharp degradation in how often you actually would start to see each other. So 2 random employees who both have 2 days a week of remote work would only run into each other by chance 29% of the time. That's about 6 times a month. And if you get to 3 days a week, they're only seeing each other 3 times a month, or 30 times. It's actually less than 3. It's about 2.5, which equates to about 30 times a year that 2 employees would run into each other. The right chart just really looks at it across a team. If you wanted half your team together, the degradation is even more stark. If you go, have a team of 10 people there, you go to work from home 1 day a week, you guys are going to see, half the team in on any given day only once a week, about 20% of the time. So this stuff does need to be managed, and it does need to focus on, what I'll call personas. It needs to pay attention to what department people are in, what are the tasks they're doing, what are their preferences, what are their demographics and their psychographics. So one of the key things we've seen, this is showing employees who indicate they're experiencing challenges working from home. And so the higher bars for the younger generations means that they are struggling more. And that is true across the globe. As you can see here. So baby boomers are further along in their career, more likely to have space at home to work, have stronger networks, have less need than Gen Z in particular, and the youngest millennials for being able to shadow, to be mentored, to have those kind of interactions that don't happen on Zoom, because your Zoom interactions are a little bit more formal, a little bit more scheduled. And so there's a real possible degradation, and that could lead to higher turnover, less loyalty, less connection to the organization moving forward. And there's been such a focus historically over the last 5 or 10 years on attracting the best and keeping the best young talent, that this is not how you want to come out of a recession or a pandemic. I know we're short on time, so just a couple of things about some historical work we did on net absorption. So we looked at government data around how many people were actually working remotely in 2005 versus 2019. You can see the United States there in the middle in the orange and dark blue. So it went from roughly 5% to 9% over that time. If you move a little bit to the right there between Chicago and Pittsburgh, you will see Cincinnati, which went from about 4% to about 8.5%. So it was near the bottom in 2005 and kind of more in the middle, although just to the right of the middle, whereas we saw the biggest growth actually, Cincinnati was the number 10 fastest grower in work from home, if you will, over that 15-year period. The top 10 markets were predominantly made up of Sunbelt markets, so like Austin, Atlanta, and Charlotte, as well as other Midwestern cities, so including Cincinnati in the top 10. Detroit was in there as well, and Indianapolis. And I'll just make this final point. We did some analysis and some scenarios where we kind of did a Monte Carlo, thousands of different simulations to try to identify how much of an impact did work from home have on net absorption, and that can help us think through what that looks like moving forward. And essentially there was a 28 basis point impact based on the total inventory. So you could expect the annual absorption was negatively impacted by work from home growth by about 28 basis points, so 0.28 of the total inventory. So not nothing, but not also earth-shattering or market shifting, as Kevin mentioned earlier. And Cincinnati actually falls right in the middle there. It's right along the 190 and the 0.25 percentage point there. It's one of those two red boxes. So Cincinnati is kind of right in the norm along with the US average in terms of how much work from home helped suppress absorption. And some of the other analysis we've done moving forward shows that going in through the next decade, we're expecting that the job gains there in that medium blue are going to way outgrow and outpace the loss in absorption that we'll see from permanent work from home, which hovers around 9 to 11% per year in these calculations, or 9 to 11 million square feet, excuse me, per year. And then you add on top of that some agile work, which will add another 3 million square feet of negative or drag on the absorption. But again, that job gains that both the previous speakers mentioned are really going to continue to drive the demand for office space, both nationally and markets like Cincinnati.
Great, thank you, David. That was very insightful. Obviously, a lot of research went into this presentation. We do have a couple of questions. First question is for Calvin. And Calvin, the question is essentially, during the current cycle, you referenced a new low depressed, for lack of a better word, supply figure, which presumably reflects the lack of new construction of Class A office space. Does it also include the loss of Class B and C space that may be repurposed for something other than office, whether that be residential or something else?
Yes, the way I calculated this was looking at the overall office stock, regardless of of grade or quality, and how much it was growing annually. It's also consistent if you just look at the construction, and of course, most of the construction, the newer buildings are going to be Class A. So you get a similar trend. By definition, you don't have new 30-year-old office buildings coming in. You have the aging of the existing stock, and the new construction, net of any tear downs, is what drives the growth. But any way you slice it, it's been much slower net additions to the office stock, and that'll make it easier for us to adjust to this current shock. And if I could just make one brief comment about what David was showing with the Monte Carlo simulations, where he said net absorption, the estimated national average of minus 0.28, or somewhere around a third of a percentage point impact on net absorption. Well, that's actually what I showed in the aggregate data of about minus 0.5. In my world, minus 0.5 and minus 0.3 are close enough to say we're looking at the same trend there. And I, as an economist, when two people measure things with different methodology, different data samples, different periods, or different method, different data, and come up with very similar, it gives me a lot more confidence that we're looking at the same thing.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. I think this is probably a good question for David regarding the global data in terms of the ability to work remotely. How do you define ability to work remotely? Does it more have to do with job function? Is it access to the correct technology? Is it more company culture driven? Is there one factor that seems to stand out more than others?
Yeah, so it's not based on, both of those analyses were not based off of whether a company would let you work from home and that sort of culture piece. It was much more based on the types of tasks you're doing. And so there was two different studies there. One was the Chicago one, which really was just the basis of, do these allow you to work? And so essentially more advanced economies that tend to be more knowledge based and creative class based are going to have more jobs that can be done remotely than more industrialized economies, and you'd see that play out. And then the McKinsey data really went even deeper, where they were looking at what does each of these roles generally do, what are their tasks, and to your point, which of those tasks still effectively work if you're doing it remotely. So it really does, they were really thinking of it in terms of, can this work, this task, that task that feeds into this occupation be done remotely as effectively or not? And that helps inform, again, whether it can or cannot be done remotely. And then I think there are the other pieces that go into, which is, do people want to do those tasks remotely? Does the organization benefit from those tasks being done remotely? Because there is more to just, can we do the productive piece? There is is it as good creatively? Does it, really lead to better outcomes for our organization as a whole? And do I stay connected to the organization?
Right. Thank you. I think this next question, I have two more questions here, and then we'll wrap up. I guess this next one is best for Kevin, because it's a question that really relates to the local office market here in Cincinnati. What type of changes in terms, leasing terms, are you seeing? Length of initial term, termination rights, rent per square foot, free rent periods, et cetera. Anything that stands out in your mind, Kevin?
Yeah, flexibility. Probably less emphasis on free rent and those kind of things up front, and a lot more on being able to get out of leases, change leases, expand space, contract space, use of tenant finish dollars, those kinds of things. I think that, and there's new terms in leases about natural disasters, which include things now like pandemics. So where people are trying to get that, but I think flexibility is the word.
Okay, thank you. I will open this up to all three of you, and this is really our last question. What's the future of co-working space? Is the question that's coming from our audience, and as I said, I'll let anybody respond to that.
So go ahead, Calvin.
I'll dive in. Co-working got off to a bit of a false start. It came out with an idea and then got blindsided. But everything we're talking about is flexible need for space. And one thing that co-working did was it drew people in my world were concerned whether co-working would reduce the need for space if, instead of leasing a big space, you all of a sudden would just be doing these temporary ones, short-term ones. Looking at co-work, though, you saw as many people who previously had been working from their living room, working from a home office, and found it more convenient to do temporary short-term co-leasing, which is actually going the opposite direction of work from home. The evidence over the 3 to 5 years prior to the pandemic was there were a lot of independent contractors, consultants, people who were working from home, but their kids would walk into a meeting, or they wanted to have a better filing system or something like that. With increased emphasis on flexibility, I think you're going to see a revival in co-working space in the future.
Thank you. David, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I'll just co-sign that with it is currently a very difficult time for co-working, and will continue to be here for a few quarters because of the pressure and the fact that occupancy is down, actual occupying the offices day in and day out. But totally agree with Calvin that it's going to fit into these ecosystems. It's going to be a place for people who work from home regularly, but also for enterprises to be able to ramp up and down their portfolio, more quickly.
Great, thank you very much. Gentlemen, I can't thank you enough. I think this has been a very insightful discussion. I think that's evidenced by the number of participants that we had today. It was a terrific discussion. Some final comments before we wrap up. Our next roundtable, February 19th, Friday the 19th at 9 a.m., which is our annual PNC Economic Outlook. Our longtime friend of the university and the Real Estate Center, Stu Hoffman, who's Senior Economic Advisor at PNC, will be joining us, as will Greg Valeri, who is the Chief U.S. Policy Strategist at AGF Investments. And while virtual, together they'll be providing a very enlightening and insightful discussion on the current and future state of the economy, both nationally and locally. Finally, remember to follow the UC Real Estate Center follow, share, and like us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. Thanks all for joining us. Have a great weekend, and we'll see you in February.